They say you never really know someone until you've lived with them, but after 10 years of marriage, I thought I knew my wife, Laura, better than anyone. We'd been together through thick and thin, through the highs and lows, raising 2 kids in the process. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, built on a foundation of love, trust, and mutual respect, or so I believed. My name's Mark, and I'm a contractor by trade. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and puts food on the table. I've always been the kind of guy who takes pride in providing for my family, making sure Laura and the kids, our son, Jason, who's 9, and our daughter, Lily, who's 6, have everything they need. I grew up in a blue-collar family where you worked hard, didn't complain, and made do with what you had. Laura was the opposite, raised in a more affluent household where things came easier. I think that was part of what drew us together. Our differences balanced us out, made us stronger as a couple. Laura was the love of my life from the moment I met her. She was beautiful, smart, and had this infectious energy that made everything seem brighter. When we got married, I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. We bought a small house in the suburbs, fixed it up together, and built a life that I thought would last forever. But looking back now, I can see that the cracks had been forming for a while, even if I didn't want to acknowledge them at the time. Laura had always been a bit restless, always looking for something more, something new. At first, I chalked it up to her personality. She was adventurous, spontaneous, always pushing us to try new things. But over the past year or so, that restlessness had started to grow into something else. She was distant, distracted, and no matter what I did, I couldn't seem to reach her. She started spending more time with her friends, going out for drinks after work, taking weekend trips with the girls. I didn't mind at first. She was a stay-at-home mom for years before going back to work, and I figured she deserved some time to herself. But it started happening more often, and she seemed less and less interested in spending time with me and the kids. Our conversations became strained, filled with awkward silences and unspoken tension. She was always on her phone, texting someone with a smile that she didn't seem to have for me anymore. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something was wrong. After all, we had been married for 10 years, people change, right? Maybe it was just a rough patch, a phase that would pass if I gave it time. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the distance between us only grew wider. One night, after another one of her late-night outings with friends, Laura came home and barely acknowledged me as she walked through the door. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to watch TV, but really just waiting for her, hoping she'd sit down and talk to me like she used to. Instead, she just mumbled something about being tired and went straight to bed. As I sat there in the dark, the TV droning on in the background, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to admit that my marriage, the life I had worked so hard to build, might be falling apart. So, I did what I always did. I pushed those thoughts aside and told myself things would get better. But they didn't get better. They got worse. Laura started coming home later and later, with vague excuses that didn't add up. She was always on edge, quick to snap at me or the kids over the smallest things. Our sex life, which had already been dwindling, dried up completely. She was cold, distant, like a stranger living in my house. I tried talking to her, asking if something was wrong, if there was anything I could do to help. But she just brushed me off, saying she was stressed from work, that she needed space. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that this was just a rough patch, that we could work through it like we had worked through everything else. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I just didn't have the courage to face it. Then, one day, everything came crashing down. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Laura had gone out shopping with a friend. The kids were playing in the backyard, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through the mail. I noticed her phone sitting on the counter, charging. Normally, Laura was glued to that thing, but she must have forgotten it in her rush to leave the house. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was that nagging feeling that had been eating away at me for months, or maybe it was just the culmination of all the doubts and suspicions I had been trying to ignore. But before I knew it, I was picking up her phone, my heart pounding in my chest as I unlocked it. I felt guilty as hell for snooping, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know. I needed to understand what was happening to my marriage, to the woman I loved. I started scrolling through her messages, feeling like a complete asshole, but driven by a desperation I couldn't explain. And that's when I found it. A string of messages, hidden in a chat with someone saved in her contacts as Sarah. But it wasn't Sarah. It was a man named Ben, a name I didn't recognize, someone she had never mentioned before. The messages were explicit, filled with flirtatious banter, and hints of meetups that had clearly been happening for some time. My hands shook as I read through them, each word like a punch to the gut. My wife, the woman I had devoted my life to, was having an affair. And not just any affair, this was something that had been going on for months, maybe longer. She had been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, while I was at home, raising our kids, trusting her completely. The realization hit me like a freight train, and I felt like I was going to be sick. My stomach churned, my head spun, and I could barely breathe. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But the evidence was right there in front of me, undeniable and damning. I sat there, staring at her phone, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Confront her? Scream? Cry? I didn't know. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like everything I had believed in, everything I had trusted, was a lie. I didn't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by the shock of what I had just discovered. But eventually, I heard the sound of the front door opening, and Laura's voice calling out to the kids. She was back. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to sit there and pretend everything was okay. I wasn't going to let her lie to me anymore. I was going to get the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I stood up from the table, her phone still clutched in my hand, and walked into the living room, where she was greeting the kids with a smile that made my blood boil. When she saw me standing there, her smile faltered, and I could see the confusion, the worry, in her eyes. "Mark," she asked, her voice hesitant. "What's wrong?" I didn't answer. I just held up her phone, the screen still lit up with the messages she had been sending to Ben. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized what I had found, and for the first time in months, I saw the truth in her eyes. She was guilty. She had betrayed me. Care to explain this? I asked, my voice cold, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. She stared at me, her face pale, her hands trembling. For a moment, she looked like she might try to deny it, but then she seemed to realize there was no point. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it. She began, but her voice broke, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm sorry, Mark. I never meant for you to find out like this." My anger flared at her words. "You didn't mean for me to find out? That's what you're sorry about? Not the fact that you've been fucking some guy behind my back for who knows how long?" She flinched at the harshness of my words, but I didn't care. I was done being the understanding husband, done being the guy who always tried to see the best in people. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now. "Who is he?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. "How long has this been going on?" She looked like she was about to cry, but I didn't feel any sympathy for her. Not anymore. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. "His name is Ben," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We met at work. It started a few months ago." "A few months?" I repeated, my anger boiling over. "You've been lying to me for months? Sneaking around with this guy while I'm at home with the kids?" "I'm sorry," she said again, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I felt so lost, Mark. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. Ben was there, and it just happened." I stared at her, feeling like I didn't even recognize the woman standing in front of me. This wasn't the Laura I had married, the woman I had built a life with. This was someone else, someone I didn't know, didn't trust. And what about us? I asked, my voice cold. What about our family? Did that mean anything to you? Of course it did, she cried, her voice breaking. I love you, Mark. I love our family. I got lost. I made a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, shaking my head. This isn't a mistake, Laura. This is a fucking betrayal. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I could see the realization in her eyes, the understanding that there was no going back from this. She had crossed a line, and there was no undoing it. I want you to leave, I said finally, my voice steady but filled with a cold rage. Pack your things and get out. I need time to think. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock and fear. Mark, please, we can talk about this. We can fix it. No, I said, shaking my head. You've done enough talking. It's my turn now. She hesitated for a moment, like she was going to argue, but then she seemed to realize it was pointless. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face, and turned to walk upstairs to pack her things. I stood there in the living room, listening to the sounds of her footsteps, the kids playing outside, the distant hum of traffic. My life was crumbling around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But one thing was clear, this was just the beginning. Laura packed her bags and left that same night. I watched her walk out the door without a word, her face streaked with tears, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Part of me wanted to reach out, to pull her back and demand answers, but the larger part of me was numb. It felt like I was watching someone else's life unravel, not mine. The house that had always felt warm and full of life suddenly felt cold, empty, like a shell of what it used to be. The kids were already in bed by the time she left, mercifully unaware of the storm that had just hit their family. I stood in the living room for a long time after she was gone, staring at the door, trying to process everything that had just happened. My wife, the woman I had trusted with my heart, my life, was gone. And she had. But there was no time to dwell on that. I had to think about Jason and Lily. They were my priority now. I had to protect them, shield them from the fallout of this disaster as best I could. I had no idea how I was going to explain any of this to them, how I was going to make them understand that their mother wasn't coming home, at least not anytime soon. But I knew I had to be strong, for their sake if not for mine. The next few days were a blur of confusion and anger. Laura tried calling me, texting me, begging for a chance to explain, to talk things through. But I ignored her. I couldn't bear to hear her voice, to listen to her try and justify what she'd done. I needed time to think, time to process the betrayal that had shattered my life. And I needed to know more. I decided to dig deeper into the affair, to find out exactly how long it had been going on and how much of our life had been a lie. I wasn't doing it to torture myself, at least that's what I told myself. I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand the full extent of her betrayal, even if it meant reopening wounds that were still fresh and bleeding. I started with her phone. I had already seen the messages between her and Ben, but I hadn't gone through everything. The more I scrolled, the more sickened I became. There were texts that went back months, detailing secret meetings, shared moments, and confessions of love that made my stomach turn. Photos of the two of them together, smiling, happy, like they were in some sort of romantic fantasy, while I was at home, clueless. I found more messages, plans for weekend getaways that she had disguised as girls' trips, late-night rendezvous at his place when she was supposedly working late, and even times when she had brought him into our home when I was away on business. The thought of that bastard in my house, in my bed, with my wife, it made my blood boil. But it wasn't just the affair itself that tore me apart. It was the lies, the deception, the way she had looked me in the eye, kissed me goodnight, told me she loved me, all while betraying me behind my back. I had been living in a fantasy, completely unaware that the woman I loved had been lying to me every day for months, if not longer. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to go through her social media. I scrolled through her photos, her posts, trying to see if there had been any signs, any clues that I had missed. But Laura was smart. She had kept her double life hidden well. There were no photos of Ben, no hints of what was going on beneath the surface. But I noticed something else, a pattern in her posts, the way she would suddenly go silent for days at a time, only to resurface with some vague excuse about being busy with work or needing time for herself. It all made sense now. Those were the times she had been with him. The more I dug, the angrier I became. How could she do this? How could she throw away everything we had built together, our family, our life, for some fling with a guy she barely knew? And what kind of man was Ben, that he would involve himself with a married woman, knowing full well what he was doing to her husband and kids? I knew I needed to confront him, to look him in the eye and make him understand the damage he had caused. But first, I needed to talk to Laura. As much as I hated the thought of seeing her, I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. There were too many questions that needed answers, too many things that needed to be said. And if I was going to protect my kids from this mess, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I finally agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near her parents' house, where she had been staying since I kicked her out. I felt sick to my stomach as I walked in, my nerves on edge, my heart pounding. I spotted her sitting at a table in the corner, looking small and fragile, like she was barely holding herself together. But I didn't care. She had done this to herself. She looked up as I approached, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Mark," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Thank you for coming." I didn't respond. I just sat down across from her, my arms crossed, waiting for her to start talking. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know how much I regret what I've done." "Why?" I asked, my voice flat and cold. "Why did you do it, Laura? Why did you throw everything away for some guy you barely know?" She flinched at the harshness of my tone, but she didn't look away. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I was unhappy, Mark. I felt like you didn't see me anymore, like we were just going through the motions. I know that's no excuse, but I was lonely, and Ben, he made me feel alive again." "Alive?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You think fucking another man behind my back made you feel alive? What about our family, Laura? What about our kids? Did they mean anything to you?" "Of course they did," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I love them more than anything. I love you, too, Mark. I never stopped loving you. I got lost." "Lost?" I spat, shaking my head in disbelief. "You weren't lost, Laura. You were selfish. You wanted something new, something exciting, and you didn't care who you hurt in the process." She nodded, her sobs growing louder. "I know. I know I was selfish. I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But please, Mark, don't take the kids away from me. They're my whole world." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The kids. I hadn't even begun to think about what all of this meant for them. How was I supposed to protect them from this? How was I supposed to explain that their mother had betrayed us all? "I don't know what's going to happen, Laura," I said finally, my voice tight with emotion. "But right now, I can't even look at you without feeling like I'm going to explode. I need time to figure this out." "We both do." She nodded, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. "I understand. But please, Mark, let me see the kids. I can't stand the thought of being away from them." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. As much as I wanted to punish her, to make her feel the pain she had caused me, I knew that keeping the kids from her wasn't the answer. They needed their mother, no matter how much she had hurt me. "Fine," I said, my voice flat. "You can see them. But I need to be there. I'm not ready to let them be alone with you yet." She nodded again, her shoulders slumping with relief. Thank you, Mark. I know I don't deserve it, but thank you. I didn't respond. I just stood up from the table, my mind racing with everything that still needed to be done. There was no going back now, no undoing the damage that had been done. But I was determined to protect my kids, no matter what it took. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt the weight of the situation bearing down on me. My marriage was over, my family was shattered, and there was no easy way to fix any of it. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let Laura's betrayal define the rest of my life. I was going to take control of the situation, to make sure that Jason and Lily were safe, loved, and protected from the chaos their mother had created. And I was going to start by dealing with Ben. He was just as guilty as Laura, and I wasn't about to let him get away with what he had done. He had destroyed my marriage, my family, and he was going to pay for that. I didn't know how yet, but I would find a way. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But I was ready for it. I had no choice. The conversation with Laura left me with a raw, gnawing pain in my chest that I couldn't shake. I had expected her to have some kind of excuse, some kind of reason that would make sense of the chaos she'd thrown our lives into, but all she had was regret. Regret and empty words. But there was no turning back now, the damage was done. My marriage was over, and I had to protect my kids from the wreckage that was left behind. But before I could move forward, there was still one more thing I needed to do: confront Ben. The man who had not only fucked my wife but had also torn apart everything I held dear. The more I thought about him, the more the anger simmered, growing hotter with each passing day. I didn't just want to confront him, I needed to. I needed to see his face, to look him in the eye, and make him understand the hell he had unleashed on my family. I knew where Ben worked, I had found out from the texts between him and Laura. He was a manager at a mid-sized tech company downtown, the kind of guy who probably thought he was untouchable, sneaking around with another man's wife and living his life like he was some kind of hero in his own story. Well, it was time to show him just how wrong he was. I waited until the end of the week, when my emotions had cooled just enough for me to think clearly, but not enough to let go of the rage that was fueling me. I called in sick to work that Friday and made my way to Ben's office. It was a sleek, modern building, all glass and steel, reflecting the bright afternoon sun. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, my heart pounding with anticipation, my fists clenched at my sides. As I walked into the lobby, the receptionist barely glanced up from her computer screen as I approached the front desk. "Hi, can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but distracted. "Yeah, I'm here to see Ben Harris," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, finally looking up at me. "No, but it's important," I replied, forcing a calm I didn't feel. She hesitated, glancing at her computer screen. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you up without an appointment. I can leave a message for him if you'd like." I wasn't going to be brushed off that easily. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Tell him it's about Laura. He'll want to see me." The receptionist's eyes flickered with something, recognition, maybe, but she didn't argue. She picked up the phone, dialed a number, and spoke quietly into the receiver. After a moment, she nodded and hung up. "Mr. Harris will see you," she said, her tone more cautious now. "Take the elevator to the 5th floor, his office is down the hall to the left." I thanked her and headed toward the elevators, feeling the tension build with each step. As the elevator doors closed, sealing me in the small, mirrored box, I stared at my reflection. My face was set in a hard, cold expression, one I barely recognized. But it was fitting. I wasn't here to make peace, I was here to make sure Ben understood exactly what he had done. When the elevator doors opened on the 5th floor, I stepped out into a sleek, modern office space. The walls were lined with glass partitions, and the sound of keyboards clacking and phones ringing filled the air. I ignored it all, my focus solely on the man I was about to face. Ben's office was at the end of the hall, his name etched on a sleek, silver plaque beside the door. I didn't knock, I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, letting it close behind me with a soft click. Ben was sitting at his desk, his back to the window, his gaze fixed on a computer screen. He looked up as I entered, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition, and then to something else, fear. "Mark," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying tension. "I wasn't expecting you." "No, I bet you weren't," I replied, my voice cold as I took a step closer. "But we need to talk." He leaned back in his chair, trying to maintain an air of calm, but I could see the unease in his eyes, the way his hands fidgeted slightly on the desk. "Look, Mark, I know what you're here for, and I want you to know that I'm sorry. I never meant for things to get this far." "Sorry?" I echoed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You think sorry even begins to cover what you've done? You think you can just say that and everything will be fine?" "Look, I know you're angry," Ben began, but I cut him off. "Angry doesn't even begin to describe what I am," I snapped, my voice rising. "You fucked my wife, Ben. You destroyed my family. You think you can just walk away from that?" He swallowed, his facade of calm cracking. "I'm not trying to walk away, Mark. I know I messed up. But Laura and I, it wasn't just about sex. We connected in a way that. Don't you dare try to justify this," I interrupted, stepping closer, my fists clenched at my sides. "You don't get to talk about connection when you've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, lying to her." Ben stood up from his desk, his hands held out in what I guessed was supposed to be a placating gesture. "I'm not trying to justify it, Mark. I'm just trying to explain." "You don't need to explain anything to me," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You need to listen. You think you're the first guy who's ever convinced himself that fucking another man's wife was about something more than just sex? You think that makes you special?" He flinched at the venom in my voice, but he didn't back down. "I'm not proud of what I've done. But it wasn't just some fling for me, Mark. I care about Laura." The audacity of his words, the nerve of this man standing in front of me, trying to justify his actions, was almost too much to bear. I wanted to punch him, to wipe that self-righteous look off his face, but I forced myself to stay in control. I wasn't going to stoop to his level, no matter how much I wanted to. "You don't get to care about Laura," I said through gritted teeth. "You lost that right the moment you decided to stick your dick in another man's wife." Ben's face flushed with anger, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw set. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he was trying to keep his cool, trying not to escalate the situation. "What do you want, Mark?" he asked finally, his voice strained. "You've said your piece. Now, what do you want from me?" "I want you out of her life," I said, my voice cold and final. "You're going to break it off with her, and you're going to disappear. I don't care where you go, but you're done here. You've caused enough damage." Ben stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, as if he was trying to decide whether or not to argue. But I could see the defeat in his expression, the realization that he had no choice. "Fine," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll end it. I'll stay away from her." "And if you don't," I said, stepping even closer, until I was right in his face, "you'll wish you had." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. "I get it, Mark. I'll stay away." I didn't say anything else. I just turned and walked out of his office, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands still shaking with the effort it had taken to keep myself in check. The confrontation hadn't given me the satisfaction I'd hoped for. It hadn't made the pain go away, hadn't made me feel any better about what had happened. But it was done. Ben was out of the picture, and that was one less thing I had to worry about. As I drove home, the adrenaline slowly faded, leaving me with a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach. I had done what I needed to do, but it hadn't brought me any peace. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, they were all still there, gnawing away at me, refusing to let go. When I got home, the house was quiet, empty. The kids were at school, and for the first time in days, I was alone with my thoughts. I sank down onto the couch, burying my face in my hands, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The confrontation with Ben, the talk with Laura, the overwhelming sense of loss that was threatening to swallow me whole, it was all too much. I didn't know how to move forward, how to pick up the pieces of my shattered life and put them back together. But I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't let this destroy me. I couldn't let Laura's betrayal, Ben's intrusion. The confrontation with Ben left me feeling drained, but it also brought a certain clarity. I knew what I needed to do next. Ben was out of the picture, but Laura wasn't off the hook. She had betrayed me, destroyed our marriage, and I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. My kids deserved better, and I was going to make sure they got it, even if that meant taking drastic measures. I spent the next few days in a haze, running on pure adrenaline and anger. Laura continued to call and text, trying to reach out, trying to make amends, but I ignored her. I wasn't interested in her apologies or her attempts to patch things up. She had made her bed, and now she was going to lie in it. I started gathering evidence. I knew I needed to be prepared for the inevitable legal battle that was coming. I couldn't afford to let my emotions get in the way. I had to be smart about this. I documented everything: her infidelity, the lies, the neglect of our children. I compiled it all into a detailed dossier, something I could present in court if it came to that. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to make sure that Laura understood the full extent of what she had done. I wanted her to feel the same sense of betrayal, the same pain that I had felt. And I knew just how to do it. The first thing I did was cut off her access to our finances. Laura had always been the one to manage our household expenses, and she had access to all our accounts. But not anymore. I went to the bank and changed all the passwords, closed the joint accounts, and transferred the money to a new account in my name. I left just enough in the old account to cover a few basic expenses, but nothing more. Next, I started packing up her things. I went through the house, room by room, gathering up everything that belonged to her: her clothes, her jewelry, her personal items. I packed them all into boxes and stacked them by the front door. I wasn't going to live in a house filled with reminders of her betrayal. If she wanted her things, she could come and get them. But she wasn't stepping foot back in this house. Then, I changed the locks. I didn't want her coming back, sneaking in when I wasn't there, trying to play the victim or manipulate me into taking her back. This was my house now, my kids' home, and I was going to protect it. Finally, I decided to confront her in a way that would leave no room for doubt about how serious I was. I waited until the weekend, when I knew she would be at her parents' house with the kids. I wanted them to see her for who she really was. On Saturday morning, I called her parents and told them I was coming over to talk. I could hear the unease in her mother's voice, but she didn't argue. She knew, just like everyone else did, that things were falling apart, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. When I arrived at their house, Laura was waiting for me in the living room. Her parents were sitting on the couch, looking uncomfortable, while the kids played in the other room. The moment I walked in, I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. "Mark," Laura said softly, standing up from the chair she had been sitting in. "Thank you for coming. I think it's time we talked about." "Sit down," I said coldly, cutting her off. I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. She hesitated for a moment, then sat back down, her eyes wide with apprehension. Her parents exchanged a nervous glance, but they didn't say anything. "I'm not here to talk about us," I began, my voice steady and firm. "I'm here to talk about the kids and what happens next." Laura's face paled, and she glanced at her parents, who were now watching the conversation with rapt attention. "Mark, please, can we just—" "No, we can't," I interrupted again. "This is not a negotiation, Laura. You've made your choices, and now you're going to deal with the consequences." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the dossier I had compiled, tossing it onto the coffee table in front of her. She stared at it, her hands trembling as she picked it up and began to flip through the pages. Her face went white as she realized what it was: every text, every lie, every betrayal, all laid out in black and white. "This is what I'm taking to court," I said, my voice icy. "You're going to sign over full custody of Jason and Lily to me. You'll get visitation rights, but that's it. You're not going to fight me on this, Laura. If you do, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you've done." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at me, her voice breaking. "Mark, please. I'm their mother. I love them. Don't take them away from me." "You should have thought about that before you decided to fuck up our family," I replied coldly. "I'm not taking them away from you, Laura. You did that yourself. I'm just making sure they're safe." Her parents looked horrified, but they didn't say anything. They knew as well as I did that there was no defending what she had done. Laura began to sob, clutching the dossier to her chest as if it could somehow undo the damage she had caused. "I'll do anything, Mark. Please, don't do this. I'm not the one doing this, Laura. You did this the moment you decided to betray us," I said, my voice unyielding. "Sign the papers, and we'll move forward. Don't, and I'll make sure the world knows exactly what kind of person you are." She stared at me for a long moment, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. Slowly, she nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I'll sign them," she whispered. "I'll sign them." "Good," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I'll have the papers sent over on Monday." I turned to leave, but before I walked out the door, I stopped and looked back at her. "Oh, and Laura? Don't think for a second that you're getting anything from the divorce. I've already taken care of the finances. You'll be lucky to walk away with the clothes on your back." Her eyes widened in shock, and I could see the realization dawning on her. She had lost everything: her family, her home, her financial security, all because of her selfish actions. As I walked out of the house, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't satisfaction, and it wasn't joy, but it was something close to closure. I had taken control of the situation, had made sure that Laura would face the consequences of her actions. The road ahead would still be tough, but I was ready for it. I had my kids to think about, and that was all that mattered now. When I got home, I started preparing the legal documents. My lawyer had been on standby, ready to take action as soon as I gave the word. I knew that this wasn't going to be easy, but I was determined to get full custody of Jason and Lily. They needed stability, and I was the only one who could provide that now. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, paperwork, and difficult conversations with the kids. I explained to them, as gently as I could, that things were going to be different from now on. Mommy and Daddy weren't going to be living together anymore, but that didn't mean we loved them any less. They took it hard, as I knew they would, but I reassured them that they were still loved, still safe, and that I would always be there for them. Laura signed the custody agreement without a fight. I think she knew she didn't have a choice. The evidence I had against her was overwhelming, and she didn't want to risk losing what little access to the kids she might have left. The divorce itself was quick and brutal. I made sure that she walked away with as little as possible, just as I had promised. She had betrayed our family, and she didn't deserve anything more. As the dust settled, I found myself alone with the kids in the house that had once been filled with the warmth of a family. But now, it was just the three of us. Jason and Lily were resilient, though. They adapted quickly, finding new routines, new ways to cope with the changes. I did my best to be both mother and father to them, and while it wasn't always easy, we were getting by. Laura tried to make the most of her visitation weekends, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. The guilt, the loss, the realization that she had destroyed her family, all of it weighed heavily on her. She wasn't the same woman she had been before the affair, and I don't think she ever would be again. As for me, I threw myself into my work and into being the best father I could be. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a dull ache that would probably never fully go away, but I was moving forward. I had won the battle, had secured my kids' future, and that was what mattered most. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through old photo albums. I came across pictures of Laura and me from happier times, our wedding, the birth of our children, family vacations. It was strange to look at those images now, knowing what had come after, knowing how it had all fallen apart. But instead of anger or sadness, I felt something else: acceptance. Laura had been a huge part of my life, and that part was over now. I didn't hate her anymore. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a kind of weary understanding. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. Our paths had diverged, and there was no going back. As I closed the photo album, I heard Jason and Lily laughing in the other room, playing some game they had made up. Their laughter was pure, innocent, untouched by the pain and betrayal that had torn their parents apart. And in that moment, I realized that I was going to be okay. We were going to be okay. I stood up and walked into the room where they were playing, joining them in their game, their laughter filling the house with a warmth that had been missing for so long. The future was uncertain, but it was ours to shape. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. We had survived the storm, and now it was time to rebuild. The fight was over, the battle won. But the war? That was just beginning. Even though I had wrested control of my life back from Laura and secured custody of Jason and Lily, there was one last piece of unfinished business gnawing at me: Ben. The man who had destroyed my family didn't just get to walk away without consequences. Sure, I had confronted him in his office, forced him to end things with Laura, and demanded that he disappear, but that wasn't enough. I needed to make sure he felt the weight of his actions, just as I had. I started planning my next move. I wasn't going to let my emotions get the better of me this time. This wasn't about a physical confrontation or a shouting match. It was about systematically dismantling Ben's life, just as he had done to mine. The thought of it fueled me, gave me a sense of purpose in the midst of all the chaos that had consumed my world. I began by digging into his life, using every resource I had to uncover anything that could be used against him. It wasn't hard. Ben was sloppy, arrogant, and had clearly never considered the possibility of his own downfall. He had left a trail of missteps and shady dealings that just needed to be exposed. The first thing I discovered was that Ben wasn't exactly the upstanding, successful businessman he liked to portray. He had a history of financial problems, bad investments, debts he had kept hidden, and a few questionable deals that had never been brought to light. I dug deeper, uncovering the specifics, gathering the evidence I needed to bring his whole world crashing down. Armed with this information, I began to contact his business partners, clients, and even his employer. I did it anonymously, of course. There was no need for Ben to know who was behind the curtain. I leaked documents, sent emails, and made phone calls, carefully laying the groundwork for his professional destruction. I knew that once his financial instability came to light, it would be only a matter of time before his career crumbled. But that wasn't enough. Ben's personal life needed to be ruined as well. I learned that he had been engaged, something Laura had conveniently left out of her confessions. He was planning to marry another woman while carrying on an affair with my wife. The hypocrisy of it was sickening, and I knew exactly what to do with that information. I found out everything I could about his fiancée, her name, where she worked, where she lived. It didn't take long to piece together the details of her life. I knew that telling her about the affair would devastate her, but it was the truth she needed to hear. She deserved to know the kind of man she was about to marry. One afternoon, I drove to her workplace, a small boutique in the city. I parked across the street, my heart pounding with anticipation and a touch of guilt. This wasn't something I wanted to do, but it was something I had to do. Ben needed to face the consequences of his actions, and his fiancée deserved to know the truth before she made the biggest mistake of her life. I walked into the boutique, the bell above the door chiming softly as I entered. The shop was quiet, filled with the scent of expensive perfume and the soft murmur of classical music playing in the background. A young woman stood behind the counter, her back to me as she arranged some items on a display shelf. She was tall, elegant, with long, dark hair that fell in soft waves down her back. She turned as she heard me approach, her smile polite but curious. "Hi, can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm and welcoming. For a moment, I hesitated, my resolve wavering as I looked into her eyes. She had no idea what was coming, no idea that her life was about to be turned upside down. But then I thought of everything Ben had done, everything he had taken from me, and I steeled myself. "Are you Sarah?" I asked, my voice steady but quiet. She nodded, a small frown creasing her brow. "Yes, that's me." "Do I know you?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "But you need to know who I am. My name is Mark, and I'm here because of Ben." The mention of his name made her frown deepen, confusion and concern flickering in her eyes. "Ben? My Ben? What's this about?" "I'm sorry to have to do this," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of what I was about to reveal. "But you deserve to know the truth. Ben has been having an affair with my wife." The words hung in the air between us, a cold and brutal truth that seemed to suck all the warmth out of the room. Sarah's eyes widened, shock and disbelief flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she just stared at me, as if waiting for me to tell her it was all some kind of sick joke. "I'm sorry," I repeated, my voice softer now. "I found out a few weeks ago. It's been going on for months." I confronted him, and he promised to end it, but I couldn't let you go on not knowing. "You deserve better than that." For a long moment, Sarah just stood there, her face pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, the pain that she was trying so hard to hold back. It was like watching someone's heart break in real time, and as much as I hated Ben, I hated that I had to be the one to deliver this blow to her. I don't believe you," she said finally, her voice shaking. "Ben wouldn't do that. He loves me. We're getting married." "I know it's hard to hear," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket and pulling out the envelope I had prepared. "But it's the truth. I've got the proof right here." I handed her the envelope, my heart heavy with guilt as she took it from me. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely open it, but when she did, her eyes widened in horror. Inside were copies of the texts between Ben and Laura, photos of them together, and even a copy of the messages Laura had sent me confessing to the affair. Sarah's face crumpled as she looked through the evidence, her tears spilling over as the reality of the situation hit her. She let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth as if she was trying to hold back the pain, the betrayal that was threatening to overwhelm her. No, this can't be true," she whispered, shaking her head. "He wouldn't do this. He loves me. We were going to get married." "I'm sorry," I said again, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you, but you needed to know." She didn't respond, her tears falling freely now as she clutched the envelope to her chest like it was some kind of lifeline. I wanted to say something more, something that would ease the pain, but there were no words that could make this better. She was going through exactly what I had gone through, and I knew there was nothing I could say or do to make it easier. After a long, painful silence, she finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and anger. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you need to leave now." I nodded, understanding completely. She needed time to process this, to deal with the heartbreak and the betrayal that had just been dumped on her doorstep. I had done what I needed to do, but it didn't bring me any joy. It just brought a deep, hollow emptiness that echoed the pain I had been feeling for weeks. As I walked out of the boutique and back to my car, I felt the weight of what I had done settling over me like a heavy blanket. I had taken my revenge on Ben, had made sure he would suffer the consequences of his actions, but it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like another step in a journey I never wanted to take. I sat in my car for a long time, staring out the windshield, trying to make sense of everything. The satisfaction I had hoped for wasn't there. The anger, the pain, it was still there, simmering just below the surface. But there was something else now, too, a sense of finality, of closure. I had done what I needed to do, and now it was time to move forward. Ben's life was in shambles, his engagement likely destroyed, his career on the brink of collapse. He had taken everything from me, and now I had taken everything from him. But as I sat there, I realized that revenge, no matter how justified, didn't bring peace. It didn't heal the wounds or make the pain go away. It just left you feeling empty, hollow, like a shell of the person you used to be. I started the car and drove home, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me like a heavy burden. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know how I was going to move forward from here. But I knew one thing for sure: I had to be strong for my kids. They were the only thing that mattered now, and I couldn't let my anger, my pain, consume me. I had to be better than that, for their sake. When I got home, Jason and Lily were playing in the backyard, their laughter floating through the open windows like a balm for my soul. I watched them for a moment, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. This was what mattered. They were what mattered. I walked outside, joining them in their game, their laughter filling the air around me. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the yard, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had been through hell, but we were still here. We were still a family, and that was something no one could take away from us. The battle was over, the revenge exacted. Now it was time to heal, to rebuild, and to find a way forward. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars would always be there, but I knew we could do it. We had survived the worst, and we were still standing. And that, more than anything, gave me the strength to keep going.